Anyone who has played a Final Fantasy game knows the world building is cinematic, deeply layered, and emotionally striking. As one of the most successful video game franchises of all time, Final Fantasy is often credited with popularizing RPGs with mainstream audiences. So, what specifically can storytellers learn from a franchise that has successfully created over a dozen distinct fantasy worlds? If we'd really like to understand it, we should go over what world building is, and what Final Fantasy uniquely offers to it. And no worries if you hate video games, no judgment. Well, maybe a little, or have never played a Final Fantasy title before. I'll explain all you need to know. First, world building exists on a spectrum. While often associated with constructing an imaginary world or setting within science fiction or fantasy, it can be as subtle as tweaking details of our world, or as complex as creating an entirely new universe with its own laws of nature. Traditional world building falls into three interconnected categories: setting and environment, the physical foundation, culture and society, the human element, and narrative integration, the thread that weaves it all together. Setting and environment encompasses geography, climate, natural resources, and even magic as it relates to natural laws. These are things characters have little to no control over. They matter because they establish the physical space where the story takes place. This is unlike culture and society, which, as in our world, can be a major source of conflict. As such, it covers history, religion, politics, economy, etc., and how often groups view and use magic. These aspects drive character decisions and interactions based on what they perceive to be true, rather than what is factually evident. These two are tied together by narrative integration. Here, rather than creating new information, writers use established elements to demonstrate how the world's rules and elements actively influence the characters and storyline. It basically takes everything that exists within a story's world, creating a domino effect where everything shifts strategically into place so that the plot can unfold as a matter of obvious consequence, rather than happenstance. And again, Final Fantasy has done this 16 times. Before we explore how these elements work together to create lasting worlds, let's break down the 5 essential steps Final Fantasy takes to build universes that have captivated players for decades. Like people, worlds are distinct in their characteristics. Each world operates on clear internal logic that its inhabitants accept as naturally as we accept gravity. This isn't exclusive to Final Fantasy either. This concept of worlds as living, breathing entities echoes what author Ursula K. Le Guin explored through her amazing Earthsea cycle. She believed world building was an opportunity to explore alternative cultures, politics, and philosophies through speculative settings. She worked with the concept of true names, the idea that everything, from the smallest stone to the greatest magical force, has an essential identity that must be deeply understood to be truly known. Her world, an archipelago where islands of consciousness rise from a vast unconscious sea, embodied this philosophy physically. Invention, she noted, is part of world building. You want the invented world to live for the reader, so you have to make it both vivid and coherent. What Le Guin understood, and what Final Fantasy masterfully demonstrates, is that the world's identity goes beyond its surface features. It must be as complex and knowable as any character, with its own true name waiting to be discovered. When we look at some of Final Fantasy's most memorable worlds, their true names become clear through their physical foundations. Final Fantasy VII presents a world where the megacorporation Shinra has built the bustling metropolis of Midgar by literally piercing the planet with metal plates to extract its life force, called Mako, for power. Our story follows Cloud Strife, a mercenary who joins an eco-terrorist group called Avalanche that is fighting to stop Shinra from killing the planet. The world's identity as victim is physically manifested in Midgar's design. Wealthy citizens live on the upper plates, literally supported by the suffering of the slums below who never see the sky. Around each Mako reactor, dead zones spread like an infection from an open wound. This victimization extends beyond the city. Withering environments around reactors contrast sharply with untouched areas where people live in harmony with nature. This victimized world makes certain story elements inevitable. A resistance movement forms where the oppression was most visible, Midgar slums. Characters who join the group Avalanche rise against Shinra after witnessing their homes and loved ones destroyed under the corporation's manipulations. The planet itself becomes a character, fighting back against its abusers. Culminating in Mako's origin, the essence of all life within the world, the life stream, rising up to help defeat its ultimate threat. By the story's end, we see this world's identity transform. 500 years later, nature has reclaimed Midgar's ruins. The world's true name has changed, from victim to survivor. Where Final Fantasy VII's world was a victim, Final Fantasy VI's world serves as a mirror. This identity is woven into the very foundation of the world, created by three godlike beings called the Warring Triad, whose delicate balance maintains the world's stability. In the world of balance, we see a steampunk fantasy realm where magic and technology coexist in tenuous harmony. Ancient espers, magical beings created by the Triad, are exploited by the Empire for their power, much like how Shinra exploited the planet in Final Fantasy VII. But where Final Fantasy VII's world was actively fighting back, Final Fantasy VI's world simply reflects the consequences of human actions. When the Mad Clown, our villain Kefka, disrupts the Triad's balance, the world literally transforms to mirror humanity's potential for destruction. Mountains crumble, continents split, and the very color of the sea changes to reflect the corruption of nature. This new world of ruin is a dark reflection of what happens when power is unchecked. So, two worlds, two environmental catastrophes, but their true names create entirely different storytelling paths. When world building serves identity, even similar themes become distinct journeys. Final Fantasy VII's world is a victim that fights back. Physical wounds, active resistance, transformation through rebellion, identity that evolves from victim to survivor. Final Fantasy VI's world is a mirror that reflects physical balance, passive consequences, transformation through reflection, identity that evolves from mirror to renewal. This is world building at its most powerful, where a world's identity shapes everything from geography to destiny. A victimized world naturally births resistance fighters. A mirror creates characters who must face their own reflections. By the end of each story, these worlds transform not just physically, but fundamentally, their very identities evolving through the crucible of their narratives. But not every world wears its identity so openly. While Final Fantasy VII and VI's worlds display their nature in physical scars, other Final Fantasy worlds mask their true names beneath layers of tradition and dogma. What's the difference between mythology and history? At first glance, we might say truth. History happened, mythology was invented. But in world building, both serve the same purpose. They shape how people understand themselves and their place in the world. Culture, traditions, religion, these elements feel as natural and undeniable as sunrise, sunset. But unlike physical laws, they're human constructions, powerful enough to make people defend ideas as unquestionable truth, simply because that's how they've always been taught to see the world. In Spira, Final Fantasy X's world, every aspect of life is governed by the religious teachings of Yevon. From grand pilgrimage to daily prayers, from technology restrictions to social hierarchies, culture doesn't just influence this society, it controls it. But what makes Final Fantasy X's world building masterful isn't just how thoroughly religion shapes its world, it's how that control is built on carefully constructed lies. Consider the Summoner's Pilgrimage. On the surface, it appears to be a noble sacrifice. Brave individuals like Yuna volunteer to die so that others may live in peace from the destructive monster known as Sin. Their entire culture celebrates this tradition, treating summoners with reverence while accepting their deaths as necessary. But this truth masks a darker reality. The endless sacrifices are a system designed to maintain control, not salvation. And the ultimate irony is that Sin, the very monster that terrorizes Spira, was created by Yevon himself, the figure their entire religion worships. This is where Spira's lore becomes lies. The toxin spread by closeness to Sin conveniently explains away PTSD and questioning voices. Technology taboos keep people dependent on the church. Even entertainment like the sport blitzball serves as an opiate for the masses. Each element reinforces Yevon's authority while suppressing resistance. This manipulation of culture to maintain power isn't unique to Spira. Final Fantasy VI's War of the Magi, a war 1,000 years before the stories start and the origin of anti-Esper sentiment among humans, shows how historical events can be twisted to serve present-day agendas. The ancient conflict between Espers and humans justifies the Empire's current pursuit of magical power, creating a cycle of violence disguised as justice. But effective world-building through cultural lies requires more than just deception. It demands revelation. In Final Fantasy X, Yuna and her guardians discover they must make an impossible choice: continue the cycle of sacrifice, or destroy the very foundations of their faith. Should they do the latter, aeons, powers they have spent the entire pilgrimage collecting, must be sent to the afterlife, rendering Yevon's temples and the faith, the aeon source power as spiritual guardians to summoners, obsolete. When Yuna finally breaks Yevon's cycle, she doesn't just defeat sin. She forces Spira to confront a future without the structures that define its world. This is why powerful world building like that in Final Fantasy worlds doesn't just expose lies, it explores how societies rebuild once their foundational beliefs crumble. When we break the world of Final Fantasy down, a pattern appears that we can apply to our own narratives and worlds. At its core, cultural deception requires three elements: a foundation of truth, layers of carefully constructed lies, and the impact these lies have on your characters. To build this into your own story, start with your core truth. In Final Fantasy X, the truth about sin is that it is a protective weapon that has lost its original purpose, and the endless sacrifice of summoners perpetuates this. But the truth should always have layers. For example, the ancient city of Zanarkand, destroyed in a long-forgotten war, exists now only as a dream maintained by the souls of the dead. Titus, our outsider protagonist, is himself part of this dream. Then consider how these truths are hidden. Yevon's teachings transform sin into a myth about atonement for humanity's misuse of technology, masking 1,000 years of calculated deception. They build an entire religion around controlling how people remember Zanarkand's destruction. Last and most importantly, how do revelations about these lies force impossible choices from your characters? Look at Yuna. Every truth she uncovers about her parents' fate, her Albed mother killed by sin, her father's sacrifice to defeat sin rewritten by Yevon to serve their agenda, until finally, she faces an impossible choice born from these revelations. Follow tradition and sacrifice someone she loves to maintain that lie, or defy everything she's been taught and find a new way, knowing that destroying sin means ending the dream that keeps Titus in existence. These are plot twists, but they're also the threads that bind cultural deception to personal sacrifice, making the story's conclusion both inevitable and heartbreaking. Remember, the most compelling cultural deceptions aren't just plot devices or tasty little things you add in for funsies. They're the threads that weave your world's identity into your characters' personal journeys. Final Fantasy has a list of famous characters that's probably about a mile long. Cloud, Sephiroth, Yuna, Lightning. Guaranteed if you exist anywhere on the internet, you've seen pictures or videos of these characters without even knowing who they are. This brings us to our next point to take from Final Fantasy. The most powerful worlds aren't built around places or events. They're built around character journeys. When world building serves character development, it becomes the physical manifestation of their struggles and growth. Think of it like the spine in a body. The world provides the structure, but it's the character's growth that makes everything move and connect. When it's done right, you can't separate the character's internal struggles from the external world any more than you can separate a person from their body. And nowhere is this more evident than in the journeys of Cecil, Vivi, and Garnet. By current standards, Final Fantasy IV, to be honest, seems like nothing special. It's a story about elemental crystals with a Star Wars-esque feel. Seriously, there's an airship called the Falcon and the villain is modeled after Darth Vader. However, it's a perfect example of how a world's physical structure, its realms of light and darkness, its ancient conflicts, its very geography, shapes the journey of its characters. Cecil, the protagonist, lives in a world consisting of 3 distinct layers. A surface realm where kingdoms wage war over crystals, an underground kingdom of dwarves, and a mysterious moon housing the enigmatic Lunarians. In this world, Cecil begins as a Dark Knight, and captain of Baron's elite air force. While most characters are locked into one class, that Dark Knight title doesn't really reflect Cecil, one of the sweetest, politest people in the Final Fantasy franchise. Rather, it reflects how Baron's thirst for power has shaped him. King Baron's command to steal the crystals, ancient sources of magic that provide resources to the Earth, becomes Cecil's catalyst. Baron's military expansion, driven by the antagonist Golbez's manipulation, creates an environment where Cecil must question everything. The kingdom's fall from peace to aggression mirrors Cecil's internal struggle, making his transformation into a paladin, a defender of the weak, inevitable. Every realm Cecil visits reinforces this journey. The surface world shows him the consequences of Baron's aggression. The Dwarven kingdom reveals alternatives to military might, and the moon itself holds truths about the cycles of conflict, power, and even Cecil's heritage. They're active participants pushing Cecil towards choices that define his character arc, and the fate of a world shaped by ancient conflicts and present corruption. Our next examples both take place in the world of Final Fantasy IX, a game praised by the franchise's creator as the closest to an ideal view of what a Final Fantasy game should be. At its heart, Final Fantasy IX is a story about identity shaped by a world where different races and cultures clash, cooperate, and question their place. While not the de facto protagonists of Final Fantasy IX, Vivi and Garnet's journeys perfectly demonstrate how world-building creates character conflict. The Kingdom of Alexandria reveres tradition, while Lindblum embraces technological progress. Black mages are seen as biological weapons rather than beings, and Burmesians face cultural extinction. Take Vivi, who begins the story believing himself human despite being treated with fear and suspicion for his appearance. The world's hostility forces him to confront an uncomfortable truth. He's a black mage, part of a race created as weapons of war. This revelation is especially devastating because Vivi's true nature seems impossible. He's shy, clumsy, and genuinely kind, with a childlike curiosity about the world around him. How could he be the same as these mindless weapons that destroy without mercy or individual thought? His crisis emerges directly from a world where artificial beings are seen as tools rather than people. But Final Fantasy IX's world also offers Vivi hope. He discovers a hidden village of defective black mages, others who developed consciousness and rejected their programmed purpose. He's not just a weapon, but part of a people struggling to define themselves beyond their creator's intentions. Through them, Vivi learns that identity isn't determined by origin, but by choice. His journey to understand this right to exist mirrors his world's larger struggle with questions of what makes someone truly human, questions that become central to the story's deeper revelations about artificial life and the nature of existence itself. Similarly, Garnet's identity crisis emerges directly from Final Fantasy IX's violent past. Born as Sarah to an endangered tribe, she survived their destruction by a mysterious airship washing ashore in Alexandria with no memories and only a horn that marked her true heritage. The world's politics shaped her next identity. When Alexandria's king discovered how closely he resembled his recently deceased daughter, he had her horn removed and raised her as a princess. The world then continued to shape her growth. Sheltered in Alexandria Castle, naive to the rougher elements of her kingdom, Garnet initially relies on formal manners and others' protection. But as Alexandria's militaristic expansion threatens the world, her journey to master summoning powers, abilities tied to her lost heritage, it's about reclaiming an identity this world's politics tried to erase. When her mother, the Queen, manipulated by one of the antagonists, dies in Garnet's arms on the outer continent, Garnet's two identities, Sarah the Summoner and Garnet the Princess, finally merge into something new. A queen determined to break cycles of destruction that have shaped her world's history. As hopefully I'm conveying, these characters and their arcs are influenced by narrative themes which directly reflect the world building. For our three characters, each have identities that clash with their roles their worlds assigned them. Cecil's kindness versus Baron's militarism, Vivi's gentle nature versus his race's violent purpose, Garnet's dual heritage in a world of cultural conquest. So let's break this down to understand how these flows work. Physical design doesn't just trap Cecil in Dark Knight armor. It turns his crisis of consciousness into guilt that literally weighs heavy on his shoulders. Cultural expectations don't just provide context for Vivi's background, they force him to question his very right to exist. Power structures don't just shape Garnet's royal upbringing, they make her confront her lost heritage. As characters transform in response to these pressures, they should in turn change their world. Cecil becomes a paladin and changes Baron's path. Vivi proves black mages can choose their own purpose. Garnet unites her summoner heritage with Alexandria's future. When building your world, consider how its core elements, its physical design, cultural systems, and power structures, can create natural pressure points for character growth. This creates a narrative where character development and world building feed into each other to create something greater than either could achieve alone. I don't consider it world building, I consider it reality building, Margaret Atwood once said. And while Final Fantasy's worlds are undeniably fantastical, they uniquely follow this principle. The anthology blurs the lines between high fantasy and cyberpunk, creating something distinctly fantasy, in the same way many classics from the 80s and 90s were. What makes Final Fantasy work isn't realism, it's fantasy after all, but relatability. This is most obvious in how Final Fantasy handles the relationship between magic, technology, and nature. Now, we've already gone over most of Final Fantasy VII's plot, but as a refresher, eco-terrorists battle corrupt corporation killing the planet, said planet retaliates, ending the company, our villains, and resetting the world to factory settings. Much of the plot's conflict concentrates around Final Fantasy VII's Mako energy system. On the surface, it's pure fantasy, a mystical green energy that flows beneath the Earth's surface containing the memories and essence of all life. But dig deeper and you'll find something unsettlingly familiar. The Shindai Electric Power Company discovered they could extract this life stream and process it into Mako energy. Safe, efficient power that revolutionized their world. Sounds great, right? Except there's a cost. Wherever Mako is extracted, the land dies. The planet itself begins to wither, and it is here Cloud and Avalanche are brought into the world. This cycle should feel familiar. A powerful corporation discovers an energy source that promises prosperity. They build massive facilities to extract it, process it, distribute it, but the environmental cost becomes impossible to ignore. The air grows toxic, landscapes turn barren, and the planet's very life force depletes. Replace Mako with fossil fuels, and suddenly this fantasy story hits closer to home. Final Fantasy VII takes this aspect of our reality and pushes it to its extreme. The planet itself fights back through a massive force it creates, its ancient magic offering both salvation and destruction. It's this blend, taking real-world anxieties about environmental destruction and corporate greed, then expressing it through fantasy, that makes the world feel both magical and deeply real. While Final Fantasy VII grounds its fantasy in current environmental crises, Final Fantasy VI and XIII take different approaches to making their worlds feel real. They tap into human anxieties about the unknown, our relationship with advancing technology, and our eternal struggle to understand higher powers. Final Fantasy VI introduces Magitech, magic turned into industrial power. The Empire discovers how to drain magical beings called Espers, using their essence to power machines and enhance soldiers. The first Magitech experiment created Kefka, Final Fantasy VI's villain. Technically a success, but at the cost of his sanity. Final Fantasy XIII takes yet another angle with the Fal'Cie, literal god machines that maintain human civilization. Humanity lives in Cocoon, an artificial paradise completely dependent on these beings. But this protection comes with a price. The Fal'Cie can brand humans as l'Cie, forcing them to serve or face transformation into monsters. It's a brilliant metaphor for humanity's relationship with technology we've become too dependent on to question. Think about how reliant we are on systems we barely understand, from algorithms controlling our social media to AI making decisions about our lives. When we break down how these stories balance magic, technology, and nature, we see three distinct approaches to making Final Fantasy feel real. Final Fantasy VII places nature at its core, with technology exploiting it and magic emerging as the planet's defense. Final Fantasy VI starts with magic at its foundation, showing how technology can industrialize it, while nature bears the consequences. Final Fantasy XIII centers on technology that's become godlike, with magic serving as divine authority and nature existing only as an artificial construct. What makes these approaches work is how they transform real-world concerns into fantasy. Whether it's environmental crisis, warnings about unchecked progress, or questioning a blind faith in systems we depend on, each world reflects anxieties both you and your viewer understand. This is what Atwood meant by reality building, not world building. The most emotionally compelling fantasy worlds aren't only elaborate rules or complex magic systems. They're truths we recognize, fears we share, and questions we're still trying to answer. So far, we've discussed the traditional elements of world building: settings, cultures, characters, laws of nature. But our last point before we dig into how this all comes together emerges naturally from how Final Fantasy worlds work, creating emotions and conflict, both among the characters and within the audience's mind. The most powerful examples of this come from how these worlds structure their conflicts. They're the natural culmination of their world's rules and lies. Final Fantasy X's Sin is a monster, a reoccurring apocalypse that has shaped every aspect of Spira's existence. Its cycle of destruction and false hope creates a world where sacrifice feels inevitable. In Final Fantasy VII, the slow death of the planet isn't just an environmental message. It's a desperate cry of a world being bled of its life force. The lies embedded in these societies, Yevon's false teachings, Shinra's propaganda about Mako, make every revelation feel like a personal betrayal. Our character anchors, people like Yuna or Final Fantasy VII's Aerith, make these cosmic conflicts deeply personal because their struggles mirror their world's larger fate. This is why certain moments become unforgettable. When Aerith dies, it's not just a character's death. It's the planet losing its last connection to its own voice and history. When Yuna transforms the Hymn of the Faith from a weapon for Yevon, the religion, into a weapon against Yu Yevon, the monster, it's 1,000 years of pain being turned back against its creator. These moments work because they were always inevitable, written into the very foundations of these worlds. So, inevitable. This is a word I've used so much throughout this video, which is why it's inevitable that all this comes down to a formula. Every element, from crystals to summoned creatures, serves a specific narrative purpose. They're not just there for spectacle, they're there because they're necessary for the story being told. This brings us to what I call the Final Fantasy formula. It starts with the world's true identity: victim, prison, mirror. This identity shapes everything: the physical setting, the cultural lies, how magic and technology interact, what conflicts become inevitable, and ultimately what emotional moments resonate with audiences. Let me show you how this works with two hypothetical stories. Story A takes place in a world that's a victim. It's set in a city that physically drains its surroundings. Its culture relies on propaganda justifying this exploitation, resources that come at a terrible cost, revolution against systemic abuse, liberation through sacrifice. Story B takes place in a world that's a prison, a society built on rigid traditions, religious control through fear, sacred powers that demand tribute, breaking cycles of false salvation, and finally, freedom through painful truth. For your own stories, start with your world's true name. Is it a victim, a prison, a reflection? Once you know that, ask yourself, how does this identity manifest physically? What lies maintain the status quo? How do your world's powers, magical or otherwise, reinforce its nature? What emotional truths must be confronted? And what conflicts become inevitable because of all of these? Remember, world building isn't about creating the biggest or most detailed universe. It's about creating the exact world your story needs to feel both surprising and true. Did this video spark any ideas for your own writing? Leave a like and share your thoughts and questions in the comments below. Your insights might just help someone who needs it. Until then, whenever you find yourself in a pickle on how to improve your story, just know, ditto. You're not alone, and I'll be here to help.